So today we wrap up our series, All the Feels. And today we're going to talk about gladness. How many of you have been with us like kind of all along through most of these? Anybody? Yeah. How many of you are excited we're going to talk about gladness, right? It's like finally something that doesn't sound negative, right? I mean, talked about sadness and guilt and shame and fear and anger and all this stuff. We're going to talk about gladness. But before you get too excited, gladness is actually experienced through the living out of the other feelings. So in order to experience gladness, you have to experience sadness and anger and fear and shame and all those. Let's talk about what gladness is. Gladness, as we're going to learn this morning, is feeling or desiring deeply, right? So it's coming to the awareness of how we've really been created, right? The fact that we have been created with desire. And we have all kinds of desires, right? We have desires that range in their intensity. We have what we might describe as sensuous desires, for instance. Like many of you ate this morning because you were hungry, or you're going to eat later on because you're hungry, right? So we have these desires that we were created to experience, but gladness is, as we're going to learn, desiring deeply, something that's beyond just the surface of what are those, what might be more regular kind of everyday desires. I believe that the lie we often buy into is that having our secondary desires fulfilled is like that's the equivalent of life and living. If I can have all I can eat and drink, for instance, enjoy just, good meal after good meal. If I can have everything that my brain can be stimulated by, if I can have all the sex that I want, if I can have my senses, constantly titillated by experience after experience, however I decide to have myself entertained, like for a lot of people, that's how you would define living. But I want to propose this morning that that's just life. That's just life. All those things, that's just living and breathing. And it's just temporal. But it isn't abundant, right? And what we've been talking about over these last few weeks is, what does it mean to live life in abundance? What does it mean to experience this thing that Jesus promised, which is, I have come to give life and to give life in abundance. That is, I want you to experience life unlike the common person experiences life. Abundant life is keying into what you were created to desire the most. Right, so we have all kinds of desires that we fill every day, multiple times throughout the day. But abundant life is keying into what you and what I desire the most. As you read through the story of the Bible, you'll find the story begins with a couple of people who desired to be like God and made a decision that they thought was going to ultimately fulfill that promise of becoming like God and receive for it the catastrophic consequences of having disobeyed God. That's how the story begins. The story ends, right? You get to the end of it and you'll find people being fulfilled by their desire to be with God, right? So it starts with people who wanted to be like God. It ends with people who desired to be with God. And there's a huge difference between those things. I would suggest that you and I, we have been created for, we have been designed, we have been wired to experience this ultimate desire, this desire of relationship. First of all, relationship with God and beyond that, relationship with others, right? And with that come needs that we experience, that we learn about as we understand how our feelings work and operate. And that's kind of what we've been working through over these last few weeks. When it comes to gladness, gladness isn't concerned with outcomes. When we talk about gladness, we're talking about something that isn't concerned with outcomes, right? Whenever you are concerned with outcomes, you're talking about something different, something like happiness. Happiness is based on circumstances, and it's based on right circumstances. So when circumstances are good, when circumstances are right, then we can experience this thing called happiness. It's inaccurate to say that person always seems happy no matter what. That person always seems happy no matter what. Because what we're saying is, like, we're observing in a person the ability to undergo great difficulty, right? Things that would get anybody down. And yet, even in the middle of those difficulties, perhaps even tragedy, that person seems to be up, right? That person seems to, like, somehow, even in the midst of the sadness of whatever it is that they're going through, to still be happy. So we describe it as, that person's always happy no matter what. But we're not really talking about happiness there. What we're talking about is gladness. What we're witnessing is gladness, because happiness requires the right circumstances, whereas gladness isn't concerned with outcomes. The reality is gladness can exist and gladness can be experienced. Gladness can be felt by you and me regardless of the circumstances around us. For instance, a person could say, well, I wasn't happy that I didn't get that job, right? Like, I wanted that job and I wasn't happy that I didn't get it. But gladness in that space allows me to hope that I'll get the next one. Gladness in that space allows me to hope that the next one that I get will be an even better one than the one I didn't get. Does that make sense? Right? So that's kind of the distinction between happiness and gladness. Another thing about gladness is that gladness allows for letting go of absolute control. Much of our happiness is contingent on our ability to control outcomes, to control circumstances. If money makes me happy, then I want to control or be in control of my ability to make money. And so as I do my best to make money, to make as much money as I can, to the extent that that's happening, well, I can experience happiness. But, all of a sudden that happiness is in jeopardy when, business isn't great. That happiness is in jeopardy when I get laid off. That happiness is in jeopardy when I don't get the promotion or I don't get the raise that I was expecting to get. That happiness goes away when, okay, I may be making lots of money, but I had this other kind of financial catastrophe that's consuming all of that money, right? So again, gladness isn't concerned with control. It accepts the terms of life as life brings them to you. You and I, we know, right? If we've been around long enough, we know that when it comes to life, there's little that we can control. None of us was born into this world and handed a job description, right? That articulated what we were going to do and who we were going to be and what the objectives of our lives were and what, like, how success was defined. Like, none of us got a syllabus, right? With a rubric that explains, all right, well, here's what it means to pass or fail. This is what it means to get an A or a B or a C or to fail the class all together. This is how you're going to be judged by that. We don't have that. What we have is we are born into this world, into circumstances beyond our control, to a family that we didn't decide upon, right? And then throughout our lives, we encounter experiences and relationships that we didn't necessarily sign up for. Like, how many of you would say, everything that happened in my life is what I signed up for, and it's gone just the way I wanted it to? Yeah, exactly. Right? That's not the case, right? Life gives us what life gives us. And gladness is this feeling that we want to learn how to engage and experience, even when we don't have control over the circumstances around us. I was thinking about the marriage vows that many of us articulated at our weddings, right? For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, for in sickness and in health. I mean, think about how much space there is between for better or worse. There's a lot that can happen in our married lives between for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, right? There's and beyond the marriage relationship, so many other aspects of living out our lives are just, they're outside of our control. And so gladness isn't about outcomes. I want to read a story found in Genesis chapter 25 about these two twin boys. And this story, I think if we listen to it, can teach us something about being driven not by our primary desires, right? Not by the thing that we want or desire the most, but what it means to be driven by secondary desires. So this story is about two brothers named Esau and Jacob, who are the grandchildren of Abraham, right? So you have Abraham, to whom God made this tremendous promise and established this covenant with him and blessed him, right? And then that got passed on to the next generation in his son Isaac, right? That God's covenant and promise and blessing moved on into the life of Isaac. And then what now was going to be moved to this next generation, of whom are these two twin boys, Esau and Jacob. And so I want to read a little story that kind of talks about, and again, I think highlights for us what it means to be ruled by secondary desires rather than what should be at the forefront. So Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 27. When the boys grew up, that is when Esau and Jacob grew up, Esau became an expert hunter, an outdoorsman. But Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at home. How many of you had multiple kids and those kids are wildly different from one another? Right, that's okay, right? So we've got one who he kind of takes to the outdoors, right? And he's the wild man. He's like the hunter, the outdoorsman, the person that just like he could not find any contentment or peace just kind of sitting idly at home, right? And then you had Jacob at home, playing on his Game Boy, perfectly happy to do that. It says Isaac, right? So Isaac's dad, Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now we read that and hopefully we say, uh-oh, you got some weird family dynamics going on here, right? Like just it is out in the open, right? This favoritism that the father has for one of his sons and the mother has for the other. But we're not going to really get into that today. So, as the story goes, once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field exhausted. He said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff because I'm exhausted," right? The common understanding is that Jacob was making this stew with lentils that was red in color. And so Esau comes in famished. We don't know for how long he had been gone. But apparently he was hungry. Perhaps it was just not a particularly good hunting experience. Perhaps it's been days since he's really had anything to eat. Who knows? But he says to Jacob, "I'm exhausted. I'm hungry. Give me some of that red stuff." And this is just kind of this parenthetical statement. That's why he was also named Edom. So this whole thing, this whole story actually lives on in the legacy of Esau because of what we're going to find that he gives up, right? He gives up something really, really important for something that is not very important. And that carries on with his legacy. Jacob replies to Esau, "First, sell me your birthright." Okay, now this story just takes a wild right-hand turn for most of us. Esau comes in, he's hungry. Jacob has prepared a meal, and Esau demands that Jacob give him something to eat. And Jacob's reply is, "First, sell me your birthright." And we'll talk about in just a moment what that birthright is. And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die, so what good is a birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to him. So there's this exchange that occurs between these two brothers, right? On the one hand, the elder brother, Esau, who has this thing called a birthright, he exchanges that for a meal. He does something that none of us would ever do. Like if you understood what a birthright was, you would never give that up for what he got. Esau gave up something that was priceless for something that was common. This birthright that he had is something that we would regard as absolutely priceless, whereas he exchanged that for something that was common, a bowl of stew. So let's talk about this birthright. What was it? Well, the birthright was, for families in ancient days, it was the privilege of moving into the position of becoming the head of the household. That's a little different than we think a head's a household today. Today, we have, if you get married and you have kids, those kids grow up, right? And then they're supposed to ultimately form their own households, and they become heads of their own households, right? Like that's kind of our dream, our wish for our children, is they go off and live in a different home than we live, right? And they form their own households. It was a little different. What this meant, this was kind of moving into the privilege of carrying on the legacy of the generation or generations that had been established before you. You think about Abraham, right? So God makes this promise and covenant to Abraham, and then as we read through the story of Abraham, we find that he is blessed by God materially. Like Abraham becomes rich. There's no other way to put it. Very, very, grossly wealthy, as however wealth could be measured back in Abraham's day. And that all got passed on to his son Isaac. And so now you start to see the development of generational wealth. So to Isaac also went the promise, the covenant, the material possessions, and that just grew into something even greater than it was with Abraham. And now it was about to be passed on to the next generation. And so there was a lot at stake when it came to the birthright because of the thing that you were being privileged into. And then specifically for this family, something far more important than all of the material well-being and wealth and riches that had essentially become the possession of that family, there was this covenant that God made with Abraham. This covenant that had a more eternal nature to it. It had a value that you could ascribe no price to, right? It was something that couldn't even be compared with the material goods that Abraham and Isaac and their children were experiencing. And Esau gave that up. He gave it up. He gave up this thing that was priceless for something that was common. Now I wonder, well, why did Jacob want it? I think Jacob wanted it because Jacob recognized the true value of what it meant. Right? This thing that was not his. These two twin sons born mere seconds apart. Fate would have it that Esau, because he happened to come out first, that the right of the firstborn would be his. But Jacob craved it. Jacob desired it, whereas Esau did not. Why? Well, because I think Esau, as we're going to find here, was more sensuous than he was spiritual. Esau was more concerned with what we might describe as those secondary desires than the thing that he should have appreciated and desired the most. Why did Esau not want his birthright? Well, we have to use our imagination, but perhaps it was because the birthright infringed on his freedom. Right? As it was, Esau could come and go as he pleased. He could live wherever the winds took him. He was a wild man, not one to be tied down and burdened down with the load of managing, this household that had become a village that was becoming a nation. That was a lot of responsibility. He was more interested in satisfying his sensuous urges than participating in this spiritual gift that was being passed from Abraham to Isaac and now to this third generation. He was more interested in answering the question, what will gratify my pleasures now, instead of understanding the value of the spiritual gift that was being afforded to him. We talk about, the sensuous cravings that we experience as human beings. We find that Esau couldn't be any more driven by those senses of feeling good, of having those senses stimulated. He says to Jacob, I'm about to die. It's a little dramatic. We know he wasn't actually about to die because he eats the stew and gets up and off he goes. right? Like there's no recovery time necessary. It's not like, somebody is like ladling in the stew into his body and the nutrients are making their way through his system. And as he lays there on bed for days and days and days, suddenly the fever subsides and he kind of comes back to, no, he wasn't about to die. But from his perspective, and given the deep way in which he allowed the sensuous desires to override what real desires he should have been experiencing, he could only describe it in that way. I'm about to die. He couldn't be more driven by his urges. He ate to his satisfaction. He got up and left, just as indifferent toward the whole thing as he could be. In fact, that's kind of how the story ends. It says, then Jacob gave him bread and lentil stew. And Esau ate it, he drank, he got up and went away. So Esau despised his birthright. Interesting little commentary at the end of that, where it says, so Esau despised his birthright. Remember, this story is being written years and years later after the actual events occurred. And the author of this describes the attitude of Esau. Just so matter-of-factly, he sits down and he gobbles up the bread, he gobbles up the stew, he gets up and he walks off. As if he hadn't just given up the most priceless, the most precious thing he ever could possibly have had. It meant nothing to him. And so the commentary goes, Esau despised his birthright. That is the assessment placed on Esau and his attitude toward his birthright. To despise it means he undervalued it, right? And by undervaluing it, that can range in meaning from he had a deep neglect for the value of what that birthright represented, all the way up to he actually had and held this utter contempt and scorn for the thing. Now, it's not that Esau probably actively despised his birthright. I mean, Esau was probably more than happy to be the recipient of what his firstborn status afforded to him, whether it was a double portion of, the inheritance or more, right? Like that hadn't really necessarily been established. But there was certainly something deep and significant about the right of the firstborn, even as it pertains here, especially when it comes to the covenant that was being passed down and the blessing of God that was going to go along with it. The commentator says he despised his birthright. The sad part of the story is that Esau would be satiated, but he would never be fulfilled. He would have those senses satisfied for a moment, but he would never find fulfillment. In fact, if you fast forward into some of the other stories of these two brothers, you'll find that there is a sense of loss that Esau finally comes to mind to accept. That he did give something up. I mean, he describes the exchange as being deceitful, right? That he was taken advantage of in a moment of weakness. But the reality is, instead of more being driven by what is important, by those desires that are more eternal and spiritual in nature, Esau was willing to be physically satiated. But that would come at the cost of never being fulfilled. And I wonder this morning, how might someone comment on me? How might someone comment on us? What would the commentary be regarding the attitudes that we have in our lives and the way in which we allow our desires to manifest? Would the commentary be, he sure loved his toys? Would it be, oh, but she sure loved her hobbies? Would it be, that couple, I mean, they never lacked for entertainment, just jumping from one grand experience to another, right? Because we are allowed to pursue an incredible number of things for which we can find satisfaction. But the problem is that satisfaction, it feels so much like fulfillment. Satisfaction, the satisfaction of our senses, the satisfaction of our urges, it actually feels like fulfillment. It's a really, really bad substitute for fulfillment, but it feels so much like it. And so it's so easy for us to be willing to substitute real gladness for something that is short of gladness. Think about the ways in which we substitute for our gladness. For one, we surround ourselves with a flurry of activity. Don't raise your hand, but how many of you, if you were honest, would say, my life is organized around busyness, right? My calendar is full. And you look at that and you actually think that, like, that's living. Look at all the stuff I'm doing. Look at all the stuff I'm participating. Look at how much our family is experiencing, right? So many people, they find satisfaction in life organizing themselves around busyness. The busier we are, the more living we're doing. For others, it's about diversions, organizing our lives around things that entertain us, right? The idea that the more pleasure we can experience, the more we are living, the more we're experiencing this thing called life. For some, it's work. Organizing our lives around performance. That is, the more I can produce or the better I can produce, then the more I'm living. The problem is that entertainment, for instance, is having life lived over us. Like, we numb ourselves to the various things that titillate our senses, all the while missing out on actual, real life living. Renee and I, we went to the movie theater and we watched Top Gun. How many of you seen Top Gun? What a fun movie to watch, right? Nothing wrong with that. How many of you know there's a difference between sitting in the seats and feeling the rumble of the F-16s roaring over you and flying an F-16? Right? We use entertainment to have life lived over us. I know I kind of make fun of this frequently, but I love it. So let me begin by confessing. So I'm an original Nintendo baby. Okay, thank you. So I grew up. The original Nintendo came on the scene, and I'm embarrassed to tell you the hundreds of hours I invested completing the quest of Zelda. Right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. I'm embarrassed to tell you the hundreds and hundreds of hours spent navigating the overworld of the game Metroid. I'm talking to somebody here today. In order to destroy the mother brain, right? But for as bad as, not that it's bad, nothing wrong or immoral necessarily about it, but for as much as some people might regard those things as a waste of time, it's way worse today. I played video games. You know what kids do today? They watch other people play video games, right? It's one of the ways in which we have life lived over us. And that satisfaction that we get by having our sensuous desires satisfied, it feels so much like fulfillment, especially the more and more we can do it. I never withhold what I want to eat or drink. I never withhold what my eyes want to see. I never withhold what my body wants to experience. I never withhold the encounter, the intimate encounter with another person that I probably shouldn't be having. I just go from thing to thing and have those senses gratified, but all the while my heart is closed and covered and substituted for what it is that my heart really desires. And so as we kind of wrap up this series this morning, I want to encourage you in a few ways. Because we talked about all these feelings. Today we're talking about gladness. What do we do with this? And so I just want to share with you a few things. For one, I want to encourage you to open your heart to feel your feelings. The real feelings, the real desires. the things that you and I were truly created for. Oh yeah, I can jump on a motorcycle, right? And I can ride down the road and feel the wind blowing through my ears and just feel like I'm alive, right? This is living. That's a sensuous desire being satisfied. Nothing wrong with it. But don't let the compilation of all of those things become a substitute for what your heart truly, truly craves. If you don't mind bearing with me, as a refresher, I want to talk through very quickly the feelings that we have talked about over these last few weeks and encourage you to not let yourself be impaired in feeling those feelings, but that you let those feelings ultimately accomplish what they were designed to do. For one, we talked about hurt. And the impairment of hurt is resentment. When we feel hurt by another person, if we don't deal with that hurt, if we don't feel that hurt, if we don't engage that hurt, we will instead harbor resentment toward that other person, toward those other people. But the intention of hurt, the reason why God gave us the gift of this feeling of hurt was so that we could pursue healing and so that we could find courage to reach out again for intimacy. When we experience that feeling of loneliness, we can impair that feeling by giving in to apathy. This, I'm alone, I'm always going to be alone, I'm never going to be worthwhile to anyone. And so we start to encrust our heart with apathy, and we protect ourselves from that feeling of loneliness instead of allowing loneliness to do what it was intended to do, which is compel us to reach out for intimacy, to reach out to others so that we can be known for who we really are. The feeling of sadness can be impaired by self-pity, right? Sad things happen to us. The sad things are going to happen to you. There's going to be letdowns and disappointments. Are you going to let sadness be impaired by just wallowing in self-pity? Or are you going to just engage that sadness to the point where it can become acceptance? Where you begin to accept life as life comes to you. The feeling of anger is impaired by depression. It's impaired by self-will. Whereas anger was designed to reveal the passions of our hearts and to compel us to act appropriately on those passions. The feeling of fear can lead to a desire to get control, or to become paralyzed in anxiety, or to rage against others instead of doing what it was intended to do, which is move us to faith and wisdom. The feeling of shame can become toxic shame, this idea that I am worthless, I am worth nothing. Whereas it was designed to provoke in us an understanding of our own limitations and produce humility in our lives. Guilt can also lead to toxic shame, or on the other hand, shamelessness. I'm going to do whatever I want to do without any regard for whether it's right or wrong, moral or immoral. But guilt, when we feel guilt, the intention behind guilt is to move us towards seeking forgiveness. Forgiveness from God, forgiveness from other people. And in that seeking of forgiveness, find real freedom. And then finally, today we're talking about gladness. And the impairment of gladness is living sensually in the world, chasing after an empty and vain existence. Kind of like what the writer of Ecclesiastes wrote about when he said, you know what, I did everything and I went everywhere and I experienced all that I could and I ate and I drank, and you know what, it's all meaningless. Where gladness, if we open our hearts to our feelings, is intended to give us the gift of joy and celebration, even in the midst of sadness and disappointment. So open your heart to feel your feelings. Secondly, tell the truth. Boy, I can't tell you how much, like, as if that first one isn't hard enough for many of us, the second one is even harder. The second one is tell the truth about your heart to someone else. Tell somebody else the truth about your heart. Tell somebody the truth about you. Tell somebody the truth, the open, naked, authentic truth about you to someone that you trust. Be vulnerable. The feelings of our hearts reveal what our true needs are, and we do so much to suppress our feeling of neediness. Like, no, I'll take care of my needs. Like, I'm not going to put my heart out there for somebody to just stomp on and destroy and to take advantage of, right? That's happened to me way too many times, and I'm just not going to do it again. Listen, if we're unwilling to open our hearts and become vulnerable with another person, with other people, and with God, we will never live, we will never experience life in abundance. And finally, give your heart to God and let God do what God does. Some of you may feel like you've done this. Some of you may feel like you're doing this. Some of you, this is not even on your radar, and that's fine. But I want to encourage you to think about what it means to give your heart to God and let God do what God does. This might mean asking God for help. This might mean doing something you've never done before, of calling out to this being you're not even sure exists, but there's something in you telling you, not only is God real, but God loves you. And God wants to be in relationship with you. That is the very fabric and nature of who you are and what you were created to be and what you were created to experience, trying to get out from the shell that has encapsulated all of your life. Give your heart to God and let God do what God does. This can mean asking God for help. This can also mean asking other people who know how to ask God for help. I'm going to invite the band to come, and as we start to kind of get done, we're going to sing a couple songs together, and we're also going to have communion together this morning. And I want to read for you out of the Gospel of Luke, the narrative where Jesus instituted this thing that we're about to do of communion, eating the crackers and the juice. I want you to listen. It says, when the hour came, right? That is, the hour for Jesus to finish what he had come to do. When the hour came, it said, he reclined at the table and the apostles with him. And then he said to them, I have fervently desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Listen to those words. I have fervently desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. You know what that is? That's gladness. I have fervently desired to eat this with you before I suffer. That is gladness. I know it doesn't sound like gladness, but that is gladness. Gladness gives us the gift of joy with sadness. And that's exactly what Jesus is expressing there as he is looking forward to what is just around the corner for him. The time in which he is going to fulfill what he had come here to do and to accomplish. There is a joy with sadness, a joy for what this was ultimately going to mean, not only for the disciples gathered there around the table, but for everyone that followed after them, including you and me. Sure, sadness for what was about to happen to him, but joy for what it meant. You know, we experience gladness. We experience it in things like when a father gives away his daughter at her wedding. That's gladness. That's joy with sadness. That's joy for this new chapter that his daughter is embarking on in her life as she is setting out to establish a new family, her family. It's sadness with the reality that The relationship between father and daughter is never going to be the same again. But it's joy for the memories that have been formed and for the future and the hope that comes with that moment. We experience gladness when parents drop their kids off to college for the first time. You know that feeling that your little boy, your little girl, that you no longer have control over, that you no longer get to boss around, that isn't even going to be physically within your authority. Now they're off, beginning a life on their own. That's gladness. It's joy. Joy for the future. Joy for the success. That joy for the fact that they made it this far. But sadness in realizing it's never going to be the same. We experience gladness when we celebrate, the loss of the last game of the season. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, either you yourself as a competitor or with your kids, that, the season all kind of gets down to the end. And in that very last game, the championship game perhaps, you lose. You don't pull it out. And there's disappointment and there's sadness in that. But there's joy in the accomplishment of all that you did to get there. There's joy in the hope that, we're going to try again next year. And next year we're going to do it. That's gladness. Finally, gladness is or can be saying goodbye to a loved one. Gladness is something that we experience when we reflect on the joy of memories that we've made, but understand and feel the real depth of loss and the sadness of that person's departing. But then again are reminded with joy the hope of being reunited with that loved one in eternity. That's gladness. Gladness gives us the gift of joy with sadness. Jesus said, I fervently, I deeply desired to have this Passover meal with you. That was gladness.